Proud was the young Duke of York, and eager to paint his maiden shield with worthy device. He was now nearly 18, boyish in aspect, yet well-knit in person and accustomed to the fatigue of arms. He no longer burst on his foes like an untrained dog, seeking only to slay. There was forethought in his eye and a most careful selection of worthy and valorous opponents. Edmund still was to be found within a javelin's throw of him, but he no longer feared his untaught rashness as before he had done. In July occurred the conflagration of the Christian camp. The day following, Ferdinand led forth his troops to make a last ravage among the gardens and orchards, the emerald girdle of Granada. During the fray, it was the young duke's chance to throw his javelin so as to slay on the spot a veteran Moor, whose turban having fallen off exposed him thus. His companion in arms, a tall fierce Moslem, rushed forward to fell the insolent youth. Others interposed. Still the Moor kept his eye upon his boyish foe. 1,000 times he threw his dart. Twice or thrice he rushed on him with uplifted scimitar. The battle racked among the orchard paths and flowery hedges of the thickly planted gardens, and ever some obstruction thwarted the infidel. Plantagenet had marked his rage and his purpose. He watched him keenly, and the fierce Gomles boiled with impatient indignation, as some impediment forever baffled his design. His last effort was to fling an arrow, which stuck in the ground quivering at Richard's feet. A label was affixed, "Dog and Infidel." Thus was the cartel worded: "If thou hast courage, meet me at dawn at the Fountain of Myrtles." The following morning, at the hour when Plantagenet was wont to see his cousin, the prince was absent. Noon approached. The troops reposed after the battle of the day before or were employed in clearing the dark ruins of the camp. Some thoughtless project might occupy the duke, some excursion to the other side of Granada. The shades of evening gathered round the lofty towers and dimmed the prospect of its vega. Still Richard came not. Sad, anxious night drew near. Edmund roved through the camp, questioning, seeking. At last, on the morrow he heard the report that the previous evening a cavalier had seen Almoraddy Gomles issue from a little wood half a league from the city and ride towards a postern, that he was galloping up to him when he saw the Moor totter in his saddle and at last fall from his horse. Before succor could come, he died. His last words only spoke of the Fountain of Myrtles, in agony of spirit, for Gomles had surely stricken to death his stripling foe. Ere he left the place of combat, Edmund hurried to the spot. The herbage round the fountain was trampled and torn as by horses' hoofs. It was moistened, but not with water. A bank, thickly overgrown with geraniums, bore the print of a man's form, but none was there. Monina had been left in Alcala, a prey to fear, to gaze from the steep summit on the plain, whereon, beyond her sight, was acted the real drama of her life. To question the wounded, or the messengers that visited Alcala, and to address prayers to the Virgin were the sad varieties of her day. In the midst of this suspense, 2 unexpected guests visited her abode, her father and an Irish chieftain, a Yorkist, who came to lead the duke from his Spanish abode to where he might combat for his lost crown. De Ferro had not heard of the death of Madeline, and with awe his child beheld the tears that bedewed his rugged checks at this sad termination of his ocean-haunting vision. He embraced his daughter. "Thou wilt not desert me. We will leave this fated spot, and thou, Monina, will sail forever with thy father on the less barbarous sea." De Ferro's companion was named Lord Barry. He was Baron of Buttevant in the county of Cork and allied to the Geraldines, chiefs of that soil. He had fought at Stoke and been attainted by Henry, so that he was forced to wander a banished man. Eager to reinstate himself, every Yorkist plot numbered him among its warmest partisans. He had for some time resided either at Paris or at Brussels, where he often held counsel with Lady Brampton. Weary of delay, he at last stole back to Ireland, to see whether his noble kinsman there would abet and rise in favour of the Duke of York. He came away, proud and delighted with his success. Promises of service for the White Rose had been showered on him. His eloquence and enthusiasm conquered even Lady Brampton. War also seemed impending between France and England. If that were once declared, every objection would be obviated. At any rate, the time seemed so fair that she agreed with Lord Barry to visit the present home of the young English prince, and, as if to further their designs, Sir Edward Brampton was at that moment requested by the Archduke Maximilian to undertake a private embassy to Lisbon. Thither they had sailed, and now, leaving this lady in Portugal, Lord Barry had continued his voyage to Andalusia, with the intention of returning again to Lisbon, accompanied by the promise and hope of the House of York. He met De Ferro in the port of Malaga. The name was familiar to him. They journeyed together to Alcala. Lord Barry was all eagerness that the English prince should immediately join Lady Brampton at Lisbon. It was agreed that they should proceed thither into Pharaoh's caravel. The mariner abhorred the name of warfare between Spaniard and Moor, and Madeline's death only added poignancy to this sensation. He would not look on the siege of Granada. While the Irish noble and Monina proceeded to the camp to prepare the cousins, he returned to Malaga to bring round his vessel to the nearer port of Almeria. Lord Barry and the fair Moor commenced their journey on the morning of a most burning day. They wound down the steep declivities of the Sierra, and entered upon the bright blooming plain. Noon with all its heat approached. They rested under a grove of mulberries, reposing by a brook, while Lord Barry's horse and Monina's mule were tied to the nearest shrubs. Slight accidents are the wires and pulleys on which the machinery of our lives hang. Stung by flies, the noble horse grew restive, broke his rein, and galloped away. Through the thick shade his master pursued, till tramp of feet and crackling of branches died on Monina's ear. A quarter of an hour, half an hour passed, when on her solitude came a Moorish voice, an exclamation in the name of Allah, and the approach of several men whom already she painted as enemies. To take to her mule, to ride swiftly through the grove, was the impulse of her fear, and when again silence gave her token of security, she found that she had lost her way. It was only after many vain attempts that she extricated herself from the wood, and then perceived that she had wandered from the direct road to Granada, whose high towers were visible at a distance. The burning July noonday sun scorched her. Her mule lagged in his pace. As a last effort, she sought a plantation of elms, not far distant. The grateful murmur of flowing waters saluted her ears as she approached. For a few minutes more, she was exposed to the glaring sunshine, and then entered the cool umbrage of the trees. The soft twilight of woven leaves and branches. A fountain rose in the midst, and she hastened to refresh herself by sprinkling herself with cool waters. Thus occupied, she thought she was alone in this sequestered nook, when a crash among the underwood startled her. The mule snorted aloud, and from the brake issued a mare caparisoned with saddle and bridle. She had lost her rider, yet her distended nostrils, the foam that flaked her sides, the shiver that made her polished skin quiver, spoke of recent contest or flight. She looked on her, could it be? She called her Derexa, and the animal recognized her voice, while in answer to the dreadful surmises that awoke in her heart, a low groan was heard from the near bank. Turning, she beheld the form of a man lying on the herbage, not dead, for he groaned again, and then stirred, as if with returning sense. Quick as lightning, she was at his side. She unlaced his helmet, nor did she need to look at his pallid countenance to be assured of what she already knew, that Richard of England lay there but for her help, expiring. She filled his helm with water, and sprinkling it over him, he opened his eyes, and groaning again, strove to clasp his head with his unnerved hand. With light fairy fingers she released him from his coat of mail, and saw on his right side a mass of congealed blood, which his faintness had made cease to flow from his wound, bearing that it would bleed again as he revived. She bound it with his scarf and her own veil, and then gave him water to drink, after which he showed still more certain signs of recovery. It was wonder to him to find himself alive, when already he had believed the bitterness of death to be past. Still greater wonder was it to behold his own sweet Monina, like a spirit of good, hovering over to recover him. He tried to raise himself, and she bent down to support him, resting his head on her gentle heart. He felt its beating, and blessed her with 1,000 soft thanks and endearing names. Though the wound in his side was deep, yet now that the blood was staunched, it did not seem dangerous. The immediate cause of his swoon was a stunning blow on his head, which had beat in the iron of his helm but inflicted no further injury. It was long, however, before he could move, and the evening shades had made it almost night before he could sit his horse and slowly quit the wood. Wishing to conduct him to where they might find succor, Monina directed his steps to a village east of the grove. They had hardly ridden half a mile when Richard felt dizzy. He faintly called her to his side. She received him as he fell, and supporting him to a bank, called aloud in agony, in hopes that some wandering soldier or peasant might be near to aid them. It happened to her wish. Several countrymen who had been carrying fruit to the Christian camp passed them. She conjured them, in the Virgin's name, to assist a soldier of the faith, a crusader in their cause. Such an appeal was sacred in their ears. They contrived, with the poles and baskets in which they had carried their fruit, covering them with a part of their habiliments and the saddle cloths of the animals, to form a sort of litter, on which they placed Richard. Monina followed on foot, clasping his hand. The men led the horses, and thus they proceeded up the mountains to a village about 2 leagues from Granada, where every house was open to them. The prince was permitted to repose in the habitation of the alcalde, and the deep sleep into which he soon fell was a dear assurance to his friend's anxious heart of the absence of danger and a promise of speedy recovery. Yet the night that began so well with the patient wore a less prosperous appearance towards the conclusion. Monina sat beside his couch and perceived with alarm symptoms of pain and fever. According to the custom of the time, she had acquired some little skill in surgery. This, when the wound came to be dressed, made her acquainted with its irritated and dangerous appearance. As the heat of the day came on, the prince's sufferings increased. In this little village there was neither physician nor medicaments necessary for the emergency, and the place itself, low-built, hedged in by mountains, and inhabited by peasants only, was ill suited for the patient. She resolved that he should that night be removed to a town on the eastern side of the mountains, overlooking the plain bordering the sea. A litter was prepared, and she, fatigued by her journey and by long and painful solicitude, yet walked beside it, listening to his low breathing, catching the smallest sound he made in complaint or questioning. Before she quitted the village, she employed a peasant to seek Plantagenet and convey to him intelligence of the actual state of his friends. After 3 days of fear and anxious care, the wound began to heal, and Richard became convalescent. Who could tell, during the long hours that composed those days and nights, the varying emotions that agitated poor Monina? That he should die was a thought in which, in its extent and reality, she never indulged, but an awful fear of what of suffering the coming hours might produce never for a moment slept within her. She spent long intervals of time kneeling by his couch, her soft fingers on his pulse, counting the rapid vibration. Her cool hand alone tempered the burning of his brow, and often, supported by her, he slept, while she remained in the same position, immovable. The very pain this produced was a pleasure to her, since it was endured for him, who was the idol of her innocent and pure thoughts. She almost lamented when he no longer needed her undivided attention. The hours she gave to repose came like beggars following in a procession of crowned heads. They were no longer exalted by being devoted to him. After the lapse of 3 anxious days, he grew rapidly better, and at evening-tide enjoyed at the open casement the thrilling sweetness of the mountain air. How transporting and ineffable are the joys of convalescence! The calm of mind, the voluptuous languor, the unrebuked abandonment to mere pleasurable sensation, the delight that every natural object imparts, fill those hours with a dreamlike, faint ecstasy, more dear to memory than tumultuous joy. Monina sat near him, and it was dangerous for their young hearts thus to be united and alone in a fairy scene of beauty and seclusion. Monina's ardent spirit was entranced by delight at his recovery. No thought of self mingled with the single idea that he was saved for youth, for happiness, and for his long-lost rights. Darkness crept around them, the clumps of chestnut trees grew more massy and indistinct. The firefly was alive among the defiles of the hills, the bat wheeled round their humble dwelling, the heavy-winged owl swept with huge flapping wings out of the copse. "Are ye here?" were the first sounds that broke the silence. It was the voice of Edmund. Monina sprung up and, glad to disburthen her full heart, welcomed with an embrace this beloved friend. "Guardian angel of our lives," he cried, "you are destined at all times to save us." Dear, soothing expressions, which then formed the joy, long afterwards the master impulse of her fervent and devoted spirit. Each told their tale, the one of hazard and mischance, the other of agonizing inquietude. For Richard, Edmund had feared, but when, wearied, terrified, and in despair, Lord Barry had brought intelligence of Monina's disappearance from the streamlet's side where he had left her, and of a distant view he had caught of Moorish horsemen who took refuge in Granada, heaven seemed at once to empty on him its direst curses, and his fate was sealed with misery forever. The peasant dispatched by Monina had delayed. Not for 3 days did he deliver her letter to Plantagenet, who still, trembling in recollection of his past terror, and what might have been the ultimate event of the prince's wound, departed on the moment for. And now farewell to Spain, to romantic Spain, to Moorish and Christian combat, to the gay fields of the Vega, to the sunny mountains of Andalusia. De Ferro's caravel, true to its appointment, arrived at Almeria. They embarked. Their immediate destination was Lisbon, but their thoughts were fixed on the promised termination of their wanderings. Soon they would bend their course far away to the islands of the turbid northern sea, where nature veils herself in clouds, where war assumes a sterner aspect, and the very virtues of the inhabitants grow stubborn and harsh from the struggle they make to be enabled to bear the physical ills of existence. Farewell to Spain, to boyhood's feats to the light coursing of shadows as he ran a race with the swift-footed hours. A kingdom calls for Richard. The trials of life attend him, the hope of victory, the fortitude of well-endured defeat. Chapter 13. Temptation. To England, if you will. Shakespeare. 1,000 recollections and forgotten thoughts revived in Richard's bosom when he saw his childhood's friend, the Lady Brampton. He was reminded of his sufferings in the Tower, of his noble cousin Lincoln, of her maternal tenderness, when under her care he quitted the gloomy fortress, his brother Edward's tomb. His mother's last embrace again thrilled through his frame, and Lovell's parting blessing. What sad changes had chanced since last he saw her. Sad and all, but that he, then a boy, had sprung up into the riper age of youthful prowess. Even with the banished prince we must recur to the state of affairs in the north of Europe. The French king, Charles VIII, had directed all his attempts to the subjugation of Brittany, which was now under the dominion of the youthful Anne, its orphan duchess. The English nation espoused her cause, watched with jealousy and indignation the progress of the French arms, and clamored loudly for war in her support. Henry, on the contrary, was obstinately bent upon peace, though he took advantage of his subjects' appetite for war to foist subsidies upon them, which were no sooner collected than his armaments were disbanded, and an ambassador, sent on a mission of peace, was substituted for the herald ready apparelled for defiance. This could not last forever. French policy triumphed in the marriage of Charles VIII with Anne of Brittany, and that duchy became finally annexed to the crown of France. England was roused to indignation. The king, forced to listen to their murmurs, promised to invade the rival kingdom the following spring. A benevolence was granted him. All his acts tended to the formation of an expedition, which was the best hope of York. Lord Barry was urgent against delay, while the English partisans wished that Richard's landing in Ireland and Henry's in France should be consentaneous. Nay, they had deeper views. Ireland, since Simnel's defeat, appeared but a forlorn hope, and they fostered the expectation of being able to make England itself the scene of their first attempt, so soon as its king should be fairly engaged in hostilities on the other side of the Channel. The Duke himself, eager as he was to begin his career, warmly supported this project. Communication with the north was slow meanwhile, and months wore away not fruitlessly. Richard gained in every way by the delay. His knowledge of English affairs grew clearer, his judgment formed. His strength, weakened by the events of the summer, was restored during the repose and salubrious coolness of the winter months. Accident furthered their designs. A visitor arrived from England, who brought with him accounts so encouraging that hope blossomed into certainty in the hearts of the warm-hearted followers of York. But ere we introduce this new and seemingly important personage, we must return a while to England to speak of Henry's suspicions, his fears, his artful policy. All that Frion had achieved through his abortive attempt had been but to ascertain the existence of the Duke of York, and to spread still wider the momentous secret, so that Henry, suspicious and irritated, received him on his return with anger, resenting his failure as the result of treachery. Frion had been dismissed, and now years passed over, without the occurrence of any circumstances that spoke of the orphan heir of the English crown. The king brooded over the secret, but spoke of it to no one. The royal youth grew to his imagination, as in reality he did, passing from boyhood to almost man's estate. Yet, when Henry reflected on the undisturbed state he had enjoyed for years, on the firmness with which he was seated on the throne, and the strong hold he had acquired through the lapse of time on his subjects' minds, he sometimes thought that even Richard's friends would advise him to continue in an obscurity which was, at least, void of danger. Nevertheless, whenever there had been a question of attacking France, the feeling that his rival was ready to come forward, and that, instead of a war of invasion, he might have to fight for his own crown, increased his unwillingness to enter on the contest. Now rumors were afloat. None knew whence they came, from France or Ireland, of the existence of King Edward's younger son, and that he would speedily appear to claim his succession. Henry, who was accustomed to tamper with spies and informers, was yet the last to hear of a circumstance so nearly affecting his interests. The name of Lady Brampton at length reached him, as being abroad on a secret and momentous expedition. This name had made a considerable figure in Richard Simon's confessions. It was connected with Lincoln, Lovell, the Dowager Queen, all whom the tutor feared and hated. Yet he paused before he acted. His smallest movement might rouse a torpid foe. He only increased his vigilance, and from past experience knowing that to be the weak point, he dispatched emissaries to Ireland to learn if any commotion was threatened, any tale rife there that required his interference. As the time approached when it was expected that the English prince would declare himself, the policy of his friends greatly changed. And far from maintaining their former mysterious silence, the circumstance of his abode in Spain, and the expectation of his speedy appearance in Ireland, made, during the winter of 1491–92, a principal topic among such of the native nobility as the Earl of Desmond had interested in his cause. Henry's spies brought him tidings beyond his fears, and he saw that the struggle was at hand, unless he could arrest the progress of events. Meanwhile, he continued to defer his war with France. He felt that would be the signal for his enemy's attack. As he reflected on these things, a scheme developed itself in his mind, on which he resolved to act. The enemy was distant, obscure, almost unknown. Were it possible to seize upon his person where he then was, to prevent his proposed journey to Ireland, to prepare for him an unsuspected but secure prison, no cloud would remain to mar his prospect. And as to the boy himself, he could hope for nothing better than his cousin Warwick's fate, unless he had preferred, to the hazardous endeavor of dethroning his rival, a private and innocuous life in the distant clime where chance had thrown him. This was to be thought of no more. Already he was preparing for the bound, but ere he made it, he must be crushed forever. In those times, when recent civil war had exasperated the minds of men one against the other, it was no difficult thing for a Lancastrian king to find an instrument willing and fitting to work injury against a Yorkist. During Henry's exile in Brittany, he had become acquainted with a man who had resorted to him there for the sole purpose of exciting him against Richard III. He had been a favorite page of Henry VI. He had waited on his son, Edward, Prince of Wales, that noble youth whose early years promised every talent and virtue. He had idolized the heroic and unhappy Queen Margaret. Henry died a foul death in the Tower. The gracious Edward was stabbed at Tewkesbury. The royal Margaret had given place to the widow Woodville. While, through the broad lands of England, the sons of York rioted in the full possession of her wealth, Mayor Tramer felt every success of theirs as a poisoned arrow in his flesh. He hated them, as the mother may hate the tiger whose tusks are red with the lifeblood of her firstborn. He hated them, not with the measured aversion of a warlike foe, but the dark, frantic vehemence of a wild beast deprived of its young. He had been the father of 3 sons. The first had died at Prince Edward's feet, ere he was taken prisoner. Another lost his head on the scaffold. The third, the boy, had been nurtured in hate, bred amid dire curses and bitter imprecations, all leveled against Edward IV and his brothers. His mind had become distorted by the ill food that nurtured it. He brooded over the crimes of these men, till he believed that he should do a good deed in immolating them to the ghosts of the murdered Lancastrians. He attempted the life of the king, was seized, tortured to discover his accomplices. He was tortured, and the father heard his cries beneath the dread instrument, to which death came as a sweet release. Real madness for a time possessed the unhappy man, and when reason returned, it was only the dawn of a tempestuous day, which rises on the wrecks of a gallant fleet and its crew, strewn on the dashing waves of a stormy sea. He dedicated himself to revenge. He had sought Henry in Brittany. He had fought at Bosworth and at Stoke. The success of his cause and the peace that followed was at first a triumph, at last almost a pain to him. He was haunted by memories which pursued him like the hell-born Eumenides. Often he uttered piercing shrieks, as the scenes, so pregnant with horror, recurred too vividly to his mind. The priests to whom he had recourse as his soul's physicians counseled him the Church's discipline. He assumed the Franciscan habit, but found sackcloth and ashes no refuge from the greater torture of his mind. This man, in various ways, had been recalled to Henry's mind, and now he selected him to effect his purpose. To any other, he would have feared to entrust the whole secret. But the knowledge that the destined victim was the son and rightful heir of King Edward would add to his zealous endeavors to crush him. Besides that, Tramer had a knowledge of the fact, from having been before employed to extract in his priestly character this secret from a Yorkist, Sir George Neville, who had been entrusted by Sir Thomas Broughton. Everything yielded in this wretch's mind to his hatred of York, and he scrupled not to hazard his soul and betray the secrets of the confessional. Neville fortunately was informed in time of the danger that menaced him, and had fled, while Tramer, thunderstruck by the magnitude of his discovery, hastened to reveal it to the king. It were long to detail each act of the crafty sovereign and his scarcely human tool. By his order, the friar introduced himself to the Dowager Queen, at Bermondsey, with a plausible tale, to which she, in spite of her caution, was induced to give ear, and entrusted a message by him, as he said that he was on his way to Spain, to seek and exhort to action the dilatory prince. He then departed. Henry had rather to restrain than urge his furious zeal. The scheme projected was, that Richard should be entrapped on board a vessel, and brought with secrecy and speed to England, where he might be immured for life in some obscure castle in Wales. Tranmere promised that either he would accomplish this, or that the boy should find a still more secret prison, whence he could never emerge to disturb the reign of Henry, or put in jeopardy the inheritance of his son. Such was the man who, in the month of April, 1492, following Lady Brampton's steps, arrived at Lisbon, and found to his wish the prince there also, and easy access afforded him to his most secret counsels. He brought letters from the Dowager Queen, and some forged ones from other partisans of York, inviting the prince, without application to any foreign sovereigns or aid from distant provinces, at once to repair to England, and to set up his standard in the midst of his native land, where, so these letters asserted, the Earl of Surrey and many other powerful lords anxiously awaited him. All this accorded too well with the wishes of the little conclave not to ensure assent. Nay more, when Tranmere urged the inexpediency of the Duke's being accompanied by such notorious Yorkists as Plantagenet and Lady Brampton, it was suddenly agreed that Richard should embark on board a merchantman, to sail with the next fair wind for England, while his friends dispersed themselves variously for his benefit. De Ferro, in his caravel, was to convey Lord Barry to Cork. Plantagenet resolved to visit the Duchess of Burgundy at Brussels. Lady Brampton departed for the court of France, to engage the king at once to admit young Richard's claim, and aid him to make it good. "You, sweet, will bear me company." And Monina, her whole soul, and her eyes expressed that soul's devotion to Richard's success, remembered, starting, that the result of these consultations was to separate her from her childhood's companion, perhaps forever. As if she had tottered on the brink of a precipice, she shuddered, but all was well again. It was not to be divided from the prince, to remain with Lady Brampton, to proceed to Paris with her, on his earliest triumph to make a part of it, and to join his court in London. All these words, king, victory, and court, wove a golden tissue before the ardent girl's eyes. She had not yet lifted the painted veil which men call life. As a child who chases the glories of the West, she knew not that night was falling upon her, while still she fancied that she advanced towards the ever-retreating splendor of the sky. Lady Brampton and Plantagenet trembled as they committed their beloved charge to other hands. They importuned Tranmere with their injunctions, their entreaties, their thousand last words of care and love. The friar heard, and smiled assent to all. Monina had need of all her courage for the hour, which she knew not that she dreaded till it came. He was going, the truth flashed suddenly upon her, he from whom since childhood she had scarcely been absent for a day. So blind had she been to her own sensations, that it was not until he leaped into the boat and put off from shore that she became aware of the overwhelming tide of grief, disquiet, almost of despair that inundated her heart. Where was her gaiety, her light, ethereal spirit flown? Why lagged the hours thus? Why did ceaseless reverie seem her only refuge from intolerable wretchedness? She had one other solace. She was still with his friends, whose whole thoughts were spent upon him. His name enriched their discourse. The chances of his voyage occupied their attention. Little knew they the strange and tragic drama that was acting on board the skiff that bore afar the idol of their hopes. Chapter 14. The traitor punished. This friar boasteth that he knoweth hell, and God it wot that is but little wonder. Friars and fiends ben but little asunder. Chaucer. Richard meanwhile sailed fearlessly, with treachery for his nearest mate. Tranmere had at once exhibited audacity and prudence in the arrangement of his plan. He had made no great preparation, nor confided to any the real object of his intents. His only care had been that the Duke should sail on board an English vessel, and chance had brought into the Tagus one whose captain was inclined to the party of Lancaster. He also contrived to have 2 hirelings of his own engaged on board as part of the crew, who knew that it was their employer's design to carry to England a prisoner for the king. He was besides provided with a warrant from Henry, empowering him to seize on his rebel subject, the name a blank, for the monk to fill up, alive or dead. The paper ran thus, so, in case of struggle, to afford warranty for his darker purpose. Richard was now a prisoner. The vessel belonging to any country is a portion of that country, and the deck of this merchantman was virtually a part of the British soil. The prince, not heeding his position, was so far from fearing his enemy's power that he felt glad to find himself among his countrymen. He looked on the weather-beaten countenances of the honest sailors, and believed that he should find friends and partisans in all. He spoke to Tranmere of his purpose of declaring himself and gaining them over, making this tiny offshoot of wide England his first conquest. Tranmere had not anticipated this. He was ignorant of the versatile and active spirit of the youth with whom he had to deal. Nor had he, by putting himself in imagination in the prince's place, become aware how the project of acquiring his own was his sleepless incentive to every action, and how he saw in every event a stepping stone in the prosecution of his enterprise. He started at the proposal and in his own heart said, "I must lose no time. That which I thought to do next week were better done tomorrow." With Richard he argued against this measure. He showed how the captain was bound to the present English government by his fortunes, how far more likely it was that, instead of gaining him and his crew, he would be made a prisoner by them and delivered up to his enemy. Richard lent no great credence to this, but he yielded to the authority of the elder and the priest. It was not in the power of his wily adversary to prevent him from ingratiating himself in the hearts of all around him. Besides his gentleness, his unaffected sympathy and noble demeanor, his gay and buoyant spirit was congenial to the reckless sailors, who, during the dead calm that succeeded their first day's sail after quitting the Tagus, were glad of amusement to diversify their monotonous lives. He interceded with their captain when any fault was committed. He learned their private histories, promised his assistance, and scattered money among them. Sometimes he called them around him to teach him their art, discoursing about the stars, the magnet, the signs of the weather. He climbed the shrouds, handled the ropes, became an adept in their nautical language. At other times he listened to tales of dreadful shipwrecks and sailors' hardships, and recounted in turn to Pharaoh's adventures. This made them talk of the new African discoveries, and descant on the wild chimeras or sage conclusions of Columbus, who at last, it was said, was to be sent by the sovereigns of Spain in quest of the western passage to India, over the slant and boundless Atlantic. All this time, with flapping sails, they lay but a short distance off the mouth of the Tagus, and Tranmere, impatient of delay, yet found it prudent to postpone his nefarious purpose. After the calm had continued for nearly a week, signs of bad weather manifested themselves. Squalls assailed the ship, settling at last in a gale, which grew into a tempest. Their little vessel was decked, yet hardly able to resist the lashing waves of the Bay of Biscay. A leak which had shown itself even during the calm increased frightfully. The men were day and night employed at the pumps, exposed to the beating rain, and to the waves, which perpetually washed the deck, drenching their clothes and bedding. Each hour the wind became more furious, dark waterspouts dipping into the boiling sea, and churning it to fury, swept past them, and the steep sides of the mountain-high billows were ready at every moment to overwhelm them. Their tiny bark, which in these days would scarcely receive a more dignified name than a skiff, was borne as a leaf on the stream of the wind, its only safety consisting in yielding to its violence. Often at the worst the men despaired. The captain himself, frightened at the danger, and strange inconsistency, still more fearful of the ruin that must attend him if his vessel were wrecked, lost all presence of mind. The prince displayed, meanwhile, all his native energy. He commanded the men, and they obeyed him, looking on him as a superior being. When by following his orders, the progress of the leak was checked, and the tossed bark labored less among the surges. "Sailors have short prayers," he said, "but if they are sincere ones, the saints will not the less intercede for us before God. Join me, my men, in a pious vow. I swear, by Our Lady's precious name, to walk barefoot to her nearest shrine the first land we touch, and there to make a gift of incense and candles at her altar. This, if we escape. If not, here is Father Mailer, a holy Franciscan, to give us short shrift, so that, like devout Catholics, we may recommend our souls to the mercy of Jesus. And now to the pump, the ropes, bring me a hatchet, our mast must overboard." 3 days and nights they worked unremittingly. The lull that then succeeded was followed by another tempest, and the exhausted mariners grew desperate. They had been borne far into the Atlantic, and now the wind shifting, drove them with the same fury into the Bay of Biscay. Every moment in expectation of death, the heart of Tranmere softened towards his victim in spite of himself. He was forced to admire his presence of mind, his unvanquishable courage, his light, yet gentle spirit, which made him bear up under every difficulty, yet pity those who sunk beneath, cheering them with accents at once replete with kindness and fearless submission to the decree of Providence. Feeling the crew bound to him as his natural subjects, he extended towards them a paternal love, and felt called upon to guard and save them. After for a fortnight they had thus been the sport of the elements, the gale decreased, the violent breakers subsided into one long swell which bore them into a sheltered cove in the wild coast that surrounds the Bay of Biscay. The men disembarked, the vessel was drawn up, all hands were employed in unlading and repairing her. "Ye do ill," said Richard. "Do you not remember our vow? Doubtless some village is near which contains a shrine where we may pay it." This piety was in accord with the spirit of the times, and the men, rebuked, revered still more the youth who had saved them in danger, and who now in safety paid, with religious zeal, the debt incurred towards their heavenly patroness. A little village lay secluded near the creek, and above it on a high rock was a chapel dedicated to Saint Mary of the Ascension, erected by a noble, who had vowed such offering on escaping, as the Prince of England had, from death on those perilous seas. Bareheaded, barefooted, bearing lights, following the Franciscan who led the way, the crew of the St. George proceeded towards the shrine. Next to the Blessed Virgin, Richard claimed their gratitude, and after due aves had been said at the altar, still in the sacred place they gathered round him, offering their property and their lives, imploring him to accept from them some pledge of their thankfulness. The heart of the outcast sovereign swelled within him. "I reign here, in their breasts I reign," was the thought that filled his bright eyes with a dew springing from the fullness of his soul. With a smile of triumph he looked towards Father Mailer, as if to appeal to his judgment, whether now he might not declare himself, and claim these men's allegiance. He was startled by the dark and even ferocious expression of Trangmer's countenance. His coarse brown Franciscan dress, belted in by a rope, the cowl thrown back, displaying the monkish tonsure, the naked feet, these were symbols of humility and Christian virtue, in strong contrast with the deep lines of his face and the glare of his savage eyes. He met the glance of his victim, and became confused, while the prince in wonder hastened to ask what strange thoughts occupied him, painting his visage with every sign of fierce passion. "I was thinking," said Trangmer, hesitating. "I was deliberating, since God has cast us back on the land, whether it were not wiser to continue our journey through France, bidding farewell to the perils of the ocean sea." "That will I not," cried the prince. "Father Mailer, I watched you during the storm, you acted no coward's part then, why do you now?" "When danger is near, I can meet it as a man of courage," said Trangmer. "When it is far, I can avoid it like a prudent one." "A good clerical distinction, fit for a monk," replied the duke. "But I, who am a cavalier, father, love rather to meet danger, than to avoid it like a woman or a priest." "Insulting boy," cried Mailer, "dare you taunt me with cowardice, that I was a soldier ere I was a monk, some of your race dearly rude." Before these words were fully uttered, Trangmer recollected himself. His voice died away so that his last expression was inaudible. The duke only beheld his burst of passion and sudden suppression of it, and said gently, "Pardon me, father, it is my fault that you forgot the respect due to me. I forgot the reverence meet from youth to age, most meet from a sinful boy to a holy monk." "I thank your highness," said the friar, "for recalling to my memory a truth that had half escaped it. Henceforth be assured that I will not forget that you are the undoubted offspring of the Earl of March, of Edward of England." Fate thus urged this wicked and miserable man to his fiend-like purpose. Awakened again to deadly vengeance, he resolved to delay no longer, to trust no more to chance. He saw now all the difficulties of his former scheme of taking his enemy a prisoner to England, and this soothed his conscience as he recurred to more fatal designs. During the short delay that intervened before they again put out to sea, he watched an opportunity but found none. At length they weighed anchor, and with a favorable wind, bore down the coast of France. The time was come, he surely thought. For during this long voyage he could frame an opportunity. During some dark night, when the ship sailed cheerily before a fair breeze, he would engage the prince in engrossing talk concerning the conduct he should pursue when in England, taking advantage of his victim's incautiousness to allure him near the brink, and then push him overboard. His single strength was more than a match for his slight adversary, but to render his scheme doubly sure, he would have the two men in his pay near him, to assist, in the case of struggle, and vouch for his innocence if he were accused of foul play. It is the fortune of those hurried into crime by violent passion, that they can seldom find accomplices as wicked as themselves. Thus was it with Trangmer. The men whose assistance he relied upon, the enthusiasm of their fellow sailors for their noble passenger. After they had again set sail, the wind blowing gently from the south, bore them onwards with a favorable navigation, till, shifting a few points eastward, it began to freshen. It was then that the Franciscan, not wholly betraying his purpose, but hinting that their presence would be necessary, ordered his men to contrive that the rest of the crew should be below, and they near at hand, while he that night should be alone with Richard upon deck. One of the men replied by stoutly declaring that if any evil was threatened the prince, he would not be a party in it. "You possess King Henry's warrant," he said, "to make this Fitzroy a prisoner. I will not oppose his majesty's command. You have him safely, what would you more?" The other apparently yielded an assent to his employer's commands, and then found a speedy opportunity to warn Richard of his danger. A veil fell from the prince's eyes. "Surely I knew this before," he thought. "Ever since I was in St. Mary's Chapel, I must have known that this dastard monk was my enemy. I am indeed betrayed, alone, friendless, on board an English vessel, surrounded by an English crew. Now let the trial be made, whether simple honesty be not of more avail than cruelty and craft. But first let me fathom the full intention of this man, and learn whether he have a worse design than that of delivering me over defenseless to my adversary. It cannot be that he would really murder me." The breeze had rather sunk towards sunset, but it arose again with the stars. The vessel's prow struck against the light waves and danced gaily on through the sea. One man stood at the helm, another, one of the friar's hirelings, loitered near, the other kept out of the way. Still, beneath the thousand stars of cloudless night, the little bark hurried on, feeling the freshening of the wind. Her larboard beam was deep in the water, and close at the deck's leeward edge, Mailer and his intended victim paced. One thoughtless boy, high among the shrouds, whistled in answer to the winds. There was at once solitude and activity in the scene. "This is the hour," thought Richard. "Surely if man's sinful heart was ever touched with remorse, this man's may now. God's throne, visible in all its beauty above us, beneath, around, the awful roaring waters, from which we lately so miraculously escaped." He began to speak of England, of his mother, of the hopes held out to him by his companion. Eager in his desire of winning a traitor to the cause of truth, he half forgot himself, and then started to find that, ever as he walked, his companion got him nearer to the brink of the slant, slippery deck. Seized with horror at this manifestation of the worst designs, yet scarcely daring to credit his suspicions, he suddenly stopped, seizing a rope that swung near, and steadying himself by winding his arm round it, an act that escaped his enemy's observation. For, as he did it, he spoke. "Do you know, Father Mailer, that I suspect and fear you? I am an inexperienced youth, and if I am wrong, forgive me, but you have changed towards me of late from the kind friend you once were. Strange doubts have been whispered. Do you reply to them? Are you my friend, or are you a treacherous spy, the agent of the noble Yorkists, or Henry Tudor's hireling murderer?" As he spoke, the friar drew still nearer, and the prince recoiled farther from him. He got on the sheer edge of the deck. "Rash boy," cried Trangmer, "know that I am no hireling. Sacred vengeance pricks me on. Son of the murderer, tell me where is sainted Henry, where Prince Edward, where all the noble martyrs of his cause, where my brave and lost sons? There, even where thou shalt be. Quick, look back, thy grave yawns for thee." With the words he threw himself furiously on the prince. The stripling sprung back with all the force lent him by the rope he held, and pushed at the same time Trangmer violently from him, as he cried aloud on the sailors. "What ho, treason is among us!" A heavy splash of the falling Mailer answered his call. The strong man was cast down in his very pride. The waters divided and sucked him in. In a moment the crew were on deck. Trangmer's hireling, scared, cried out, "He is King Henry's prisoner, seize him!" thus increasing the confusion. The friar, his garments floating, now appeared struggling among the waves. A rope was thrown to him. The vessel sped on meanwhile, and it fell far short. Richard, horror-struck, would have leapt in to save his enemy, but the time was gone. One loud shriek burst on the ear of night, and all was still. Trangmer, his misery, his vengeance, and his crimes, lay buried in the ocean's hoary caves. What explanation could follow this tremendous incident? The prince spoke of his life attacked. The men of the warrant their master had for his seizure. What was his crime none knew. "That will I declare freely," said the royal youth. "That unhappy man has sealed my truth by his death. In my childhood I was nurtured in a palace, and bore the title of the Duke of York. Edward IV was my father, Edward V my brother." "Why, this is foulest treason," cried the trembling captain. "I, or fairest loyalty, speak, my friends. Which of you will lay hands on your liege, on Richard IV of England?"